Thank you. And with that, we will introduce Lynette.
Hello, I'm Lynette Nieberge with Carbon Cycle Institute, and today we will be presenting on carbon farm planning, the process of carbon farm planning, a little bit of background about who we are, CCI, and a little bit about how we got started and really introducing carbon farming towards a climate beneficial agriculture. Um, as you can see here, I'll introduce Jeff in a second, but as you can see here, this is our mission as Carbon Cycle Institute. We're really focused on advancing our mission through agriculture and carbon programs, which is advancing carbon farming and regenerative rangeland management to build soil and carbon and critical ecosystem services on ranches, farms, and working lands. Carbon Cycle Institute we've been around for over 10 years, really building this framework and backed by research and science. I am going to pass it off to Jeff, Dr. Jeff Creek, who's a founder of the Carbon Cycle Institute, and he will kick off our presentation. Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Lynette. And thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Maybe to the next slide, Lynette. So I think everybody's aware that we're witnessing rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, as this graph clearly shows. But what we often are not quite as aware of is the fact that our land management practices have historically contributed about a third of the surplus carbon dioxide that we are seeing in the atmosphere today. And so this inset graph you see is work done by Sanderman and others back in 2017, showing the effect of loss of carbon from our soils and our working land soils and rangeland soils over the last couple thousand years. And as you can see, the trajectory of loss of carbon from our soils is shown in the sort of mauve and green colors there. Parallels are increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So we have the opportunity, what this really tells us is that we have the opportunity to return at least a third of that surplus CO2 in the atmosphere back into our working lands and harvest the benefits of doing so, which is really our goal with the whole concept of carbon farming, is to, yes, reduce carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, but perhaps more importantly, to support agriculture through the reintroduction or the recarbonization, if you will, of our soils. I think probably the next slide. Yeah. So with that in mind, back in the early 2000s, a group of us in Marin County, which is a coastal county just north of San Francisco in California, we came together with some researchers out of UC Berkeley and really asked this question, could land management increase soil carbon? Now, I'd been farming organically at that point for over 25 years, and I knew I could increase soil organic matter through management, but I'd never actually quantified that process. And that was really what we were after, was could we bring the requisite science to bear and actually demonstrate and quantify carbon increases as a result of, in response to a management practice. And so again, engaging Dr. Wendy Silver, a biogeochemist out of the University of California, Berkeley, and her graduate students and postdoctorate students, we set about trying to measure an increase in soil carbon in response to a management activity. And the activity we chose was to simply apply some compost to the surface of grazed grasslands in a couple of different sites in California, one coastal site and one in the Sierra foothills. And then we went back and looked to see if we could actually measure a change. So we put 1/2 inch of compost on the ground. And over the next 4 years, Becca Riles, now Dr. Becca Riles at UC Merced, conducted her doctoral research on what happened next. One of the first things we saw, as you can see in the image on the right, was that the cows were gravitating to the compost treated plots. And that was kind of humorous to see and interesting. And when we analyzed the forage, in fact, we found higher protein in the compost treated plots, which was perhaps not entirely surprising, but it was interesting to observe. Perhaps most importantly, we saw an increase in soil carbon, and we were able to measure that increase. Now, in year one, that was kind of a no-brainer. We've added some carbon. We're measuring that additional carbon. So that was not a huge surprise, although we were glad that we were able to verify that we could measure the change. But what we saw in subsequent years was that the carbon levels in the soil continued to rise, even though we added no additional compost. And the message, the take-home message, in the next slide, if you would, Lynette. The take-home message is really shown on the right, the image on the right. What we saw was in response to a single compost addition to the system, the system itself, the rangeland ecosystem itself, began to photosynthesize at a more rapid rate. In other words, we began to draw more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the soil and into the vegetation. So to explain this graph on the right, what you see in that hockey stick black line is the compost carbon going on in year one, big slug of carbon, if you will, going into the system. But then that compost decays rather rapidly over the next few decades. It essentially returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. But the ecosystem response is what was really quite surprising to all of us, was that as the vegetation responds to that enhanced the nutrients from the compost, the enhanced water holding capacity in the soil in response to that increased soil organic matter, the system begins to draw down more carbon dioxide. In other words, there's more production happening on that rangeland system. And some of that carbon is ending up in the soil as soil organic matter. So what we saw was that by adding some compost, some carbon, some additional energy, if you will, in the system, we were able to initiate a positive feedback where every year now we have 10 years of data showing a steady increase in carbon in the system in response to that one-time application of compost. So this was fairly profound, and it led us to understand that we could, by increasing soil organic carbon, increase the system's capacity for additional carbon capture from the atmosphere with positive impacts on the productivity of the pasture system. So clearly, we confirmed our hypothesis that land management could increase soil carbon and that it could do so at the expense of atmospheric carbon. That is, through the photosynthetic capture of carbon dioxide, we could build farm system carbon. This led us to this great understanding, really a profound understanding, that we could, in fact, reverse the unintentional industrial forcing of atmospheric carbon with the intentional agricultural forcing of soil organic carbon. And that's the graph on the left, showing this hypothetical potential of agriculture to actually be a climate solution. Next slide, please. So naturally, as we thought about this, we talked about this with our local producers. Everyone got very excited about compost, but the reality is that there are many ways to increase carbon capture on working lands, of course. And so carbon farming evolved out of this understanding that we could manage our farm systems to increase the rate at which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere and then converted to plant production or plant matter, and most importantly, soil organic matter. So carbon farming is really the process of engaging agriculture as a climate solution through the beneficial transfer of atmospheric carbon to our working land soils and vegetation. Next slide, please. Now, fundamentally, I think we can all recognize that actually all farming is carbon farming, because farming doesn't happen without photosynthesis. Farming is totally dependent on atmospheric carbon to create the products of agriculture. But what we have come to understand is that the way we farm, our farming practices, the way we design our farm operations, can lead to very different amounts of carbon, both captured and held by our farm systems. And that's really the challenge of carbon farming, is to manage our systems in a way that actually results in a net increase in carbon in the farm system. Next slide, please. So the idea with carbon farm planning, essentially, we've taken a page out of the NRCS conservation planning process, but we're really focusing on carbon and the carbon cycle and the capacity to capture carbon as the organizing principle around which we build the farm plan. We are definitely not promoting a carbon marketing scheme, which I think Elise made very clear. But in developing a carbon farm plan, we hope to support producers in accessing carbon markets if and when those opportunities arise. And that really is how we're viewing this, the USDA Climate Smart Commodity Program, is really trying to set up American producers to access global carbon markets if and as they emerge. But most importantly, is to recognize the role of carbon in our farm systems and how capturing and holding more carbon in our farm systems actually benefits farm production, farm resilience over time. So that's really the primary goal here. Next slide, please. So USDA came out a few years ago as we were moving the carbon farm planning process forward. NRCS stepped up and developed a carbon planning guidance. And this is basically directly from them, viewing a carbon farm plan as a whole farm conservation plan that, when implemented, will enhance soil health, increase carbon sequestration, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This plan is ultimately developed in close collaboration between the planner and the farmer. And the plan then is really developed around resource concerns that the producer has, while focusing on the opportunities for carbon sequestration across the farm landscape. Next slide, please. So this particular program, as Elise has outlined, is really an effort to expand markets for US-made climate smart commodities. The project, as we're conceiving of it, obviously is providing technical assistance to producers to implement climate smart production practices on a voluntary basis, completely on a voluntary basis, on our working lands. And that's really where NCAT, the USDA funding, your local planners, and we at the Carbon Cycle Institute are stepping in to provide that technical and financial assistance. Obviously, the goal is to pilot innovative and cost-effective methods for quantifying, monitoring, reporting, and verifying greenhouse gas benefits. And that's really what the carbon farm planning process, the role of the carbon farm planning process in this context, is to provide that quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification framework. And then ultimately, the goal of developing markets and promoting those resulting climate smart commodities is really where FiberShed is coming in with its concept of climate beneficial fibers. Next slide, please. So we've been working at this, as Lynette said, for over 10 years now, starting at the farm scale, developing carbon farm plans for a few of our local producers here in Marin County, and then gradually developing county level plans, engaging with local climate action plans. Across California now, we have multiple hubs, which are basically groups of resource conservation districts coming together to develop carbon farm programs. And of course, now with USDA Climate Smart Commodities Program, we're looking nationally and even internationally at expanding this work. Next slide. This has been interesting to watch over the last few years. As you can see in these two images from 1920 to 1924, I'm sorry, 2020 to 2024, we see a pretty significant expansion in healthy soils legislation across the country. And this seems to be just happening very rapidly. I think it's just a matter of time before we see virtually every state in the country having some kind of soil-focused healthy soil focused program, which ultimately, when we talk about healthy soils, we're really talking about biologically rich, carbon rich, energy rich soils. So it has been very gratifying to watch this evolution over time. Next slide. Specifically speaking for the Northern Great Plains, this quote, this is from an earlier Conference of Parties meeting in Bonn, Germany back in 2017, but the comment was made that agriculture is really more exposed to climate change impacts than any other economic sector. And that's really true when you think about it, how much and how dependent we are within the context of agriculture on reasonably predictable weather patterns, for example, reasonably predictable first and last frost dates, rainfall regimes, all of these things that allow us to plan ahead and think about how we're going to manage our systems throughout the coming year or coming years. And as climate begins to change radically, we begin to see it becoming more and more difficult to anticipate changes that are coming our way. So specifically for the Northern Great Plains, the 5th National Climate Assessment has highlighted these climate impacts. And I think you've probably all experienced these with increased extreme temperatures, drought, heavy rainfall when rainfall does come. It tends to be in more intense storms. We're certainly experiencing that in California. Higher winds, and accompanying all of this is increased pest and disease pressure as things get a little bit out of the normal realm. So again, when we think about building resilience into our farm systems through building their soil organic matter and ecosystem carbon, we're really looking at building resilience in the face of these increasing unexpected impacts. Next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, our historical land management has indeed led to significant losses of organic carbon from our farm systems. And this in turn has led to losses of biodiversity and ecosystem function across the globe. Obviously, soil erosion, very visible here, wind erosion. But what we're, I think, less aware of at the local level, because we don't necessarily think about this at the global scale, is the loss of capacity of the biosphere to actually draw down carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. So the graph on the right shows the decline in the amount of plant biomass, photosynthesizing plant biomass on the planet over the last couple thousand years, again, because of human activity that has cut down forests, degraded grasslands, and so forth. So we have not only put large quantities of additional carbon into the atmosphere, about a third of which has come from our soils and landscapes, but we've also degraded the capacity of our ecosystems to absorb that CO2 through photosynthesis by eliminating a large percentage of our standing biomass stocks globally. So we're essentially burning the candle at both ends, and that's my attempt to be clever here with this image. But the opportunity this presents to us is to reverse this trend by recarbonizing the agricultural landscape. So next slide, please. Now there are a lot of parallel movements, I think, happening globally right now, and you I'm sure have come across most, if not all, of these terms: regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, conservation agriculture, sustainable land management, holistic management, organic farming, and agroecology. What these all have in common is that in order to be successful as an approach to agriculture, they all depend on the increased capture of solar energy by the farm system in the form of organic carbon. And so we elected to describe our process, or the process we're promoting, as carbon farming, because it explicitly calls out the fact that what we're talking about is enhancing the drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and transforming it into soil organic matter and the products of agriculture. So just to be very explicit about what it is that we're actually engaged in here at the global scale and the farm scale. Next slide. So again, we're talking about the carbon cycle, the process of photosynthesis by which solar radiation, solar energy is transformed into the biochemical energy, which epitomizes or makes up our agricultural products. So clearly, when we talk about carbon and enhancing the carbon in our farm systems, we're talking about enhancing the amount of energy coming into those farm systems. And that energy then can be utilized to drive all the processes on farm, right? So carbon really can be seen as and understood as the energy currency of all living systems, including our farm systems and all our farm system processes and farm products. As you can see from this image, the carbon cycle is a huge global cycle. Carbon moves among various carbon pools from the atmosphere to the oceans, into vegetation. Of course, it's stored in fossil fuels, and our burning of those fuels moves that carbon into the atmosphere. The oceans absorb much of that, but not all of it. And then we say, well, where could we put this material beneficially? Where could we park our atmospheric carbon beneficially? And we look to our soils as a great reservoir, third largest reservoir of carbon on the planet, and more carbon than is held in the atmosphere and vegetation combined. And by increasing soil organic carbon, we begin to see all kinds of positive things happening. Next slide, please. So again, recarbonizing the biosphere, managing the flow of solar energy through our farm systems. We can utilize that solar radiation to support plant growth, which then feeds the soils and feeds the entire farm ecosystem. Next slide. So we have a choice in our farming systems to either farm in a way that results in losses of fertility and losses of energy from our farm systems, as demonstrated here. Or next slide. And this is a kind of a graphic example of a farm system in our neck of the woods here in California that suffered a long history of what we might say overuse, resulting in the downcutting of this riparian system and the dewatering of this historically wet meadow. And undermining the farm operations resilience to disturbance such as floods and drought, and undermining the long-term economic viability of this farm landscape. But then in the next slide, we see the opportunity for improving system carbon, improving system energy, and initiating what we might view as an upward spiral of soil improvement and all of the co-benefits that come along with that. Next slide, please. And this is the same farm operation 20 years later, following a riparian restoration effort on the part of the Resource Conservation District, engaging planting of hedgerows and windbreaks, managing the grazing, bringing the grazing under rational control. And you can see we can begin to put some carbon values on this based on the various tools we're using in the carbon farm planning process. And you can begin to imagine the implications for the productivity of this farm system. Next slide. The hydrological impacts of increasing soil organic carbon are significant. In fact, it turns out that the loss of soil carbon from our soils historically is equivalent to essentially the drought impacts of, or the impacts of the hydrological impacts of drought. So because of our historical losses of carbon, our drought, what the impacts we suffer from drought are essentially doubled over what they would be if we had maintained our soil organic matter. And so again, the potential is there to restore soil organic matter and build soil water holding capacity, including groundwater recharge. And all of this is really driven by our capacity to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use that CO2 to build soil organic matter, driving denser root systems, increasing soil aggregation, improving soil structure, decreasing soil bulk density, and enhancing water infiltration, including groundwater recharge. Next slide. So some key functions of soil organic carbon. I'm sure most of you are aware that organic matter supplies nutrients. It can actually prevent or minimize leaching of nutrients that are added in synthetic form, increasing available water holding capacity, contributing to soil aggregation, infiltration, and of course, sequestering carbon. So again, providing energy to support soil processes and overall ecosystem biodiversity, productivity, and what we might call soil health. So monitoring our trends in soil organic carbon can then reflect trends in all of these soil factors and ecosystem processes. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this back to Lynette, and she'll give you an intro into what is actually carbon farm planning. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was really great. I hope all of you enjoyed that as much as I did. It never gets old listening to Jeff go through that information. So a lot of you are debating on, is this program right for you, and still thinking about what actually is carbon farm planning. The way I view it is that carbon farm planning is really a creative exercise, which will really help you think about all opportunities on your farmscape to increase that carbon sequestration, decrease greenhouse gas emissions. Oftentimes, these carbon farm plans are a vehicle for increasing carbon cycle literacy among producers and technical assistance providers, building that climate and soil health expertise programs within our conservation districts nationally. And it's a roadmap of climate mitigation opportunities in a whole farm or ranch or regional framework, thinking about that scaling up graphic that Jeff showed. But really, a successful carbon farm plan really cultivates carbon farmers. So getting into what are the elements of a carbon farm plan in this whole planning process? Right here, we really look at all the different components, but to me, the most important component is really the producer engagement, where the technical assistant really engages with the producer, learns what that landscape is, learns about the goals and management of the producer, really thinking about what is happening and functioning on that landscape, and being able to work long term with producers. So yourselves in this process, we can really then become an advisor to folks out there thinking about entering in a program like this. One of the components of the planning process is being able to go out on the landscape for field visits, to do a full assessment of understanding what the management is, what the ecological considerations are, and developing site-specific practice recommendations. And then through the inventory and analysis, being able to map out and really think about what all of those climate beneficial practices are by mapping them, obtaining the dimensions, and then quantifying them. So then we can come back and talk to the producers yourselves about deciding what actually is something feasible for you all to implement on your landscape, how that could benefit you, how that meets your goals, and then really thinking about setting out a timeline for implementation, both short and long term. One thing about these carbon farm plans is that we like to do a whole farm system approach and think about what that landscape could look like in 20 years from now. So when I said that it's a creative process, it's really thinking about all of the opportunities and being able to quantify those into a plan. So although we're planning for 20 years in advance, we are taking our timeline to really scale it down to what is achievable for you to actually implement near term in the next year to 5 years. So you might be asking, what are some of these climate beneficial or carbon farming practices that you might see in a carbon farm plan? As Jeff said, this is nothing new to any of you as a farmer or a rancher. Basically, use the NRCS framework. We use all of the conservation practices. So we're aligned with other organizations nationally to deploy this thought process. So something that you might see in a carbon farm plan is planning out cover crops throughout your farm area, thinking about prescribed grazing, diving into what prescriptive grazing might be or holistic grazing, planning for windbreaks, hedgerows, silvopastures, organic matter amendments, which could be compost application if you so choose, and then reducing tillage or going to no-till. So these are just like a small suite of practices that could be applicable to someone's landscape. But it doesn't mean that all of these practices would be implemented or would be planned out in your carbon farm plan or ranch plan, whichever you guys choose to call it. But these are just a subset of a suite of practices. And really, these plans are highly influenced by the communication between the planner and the producer and your landscape. After we figure out what practices are applicable for your landscape, we're able to use Comet Planner to quantify those. And we use this method, which is through the Quantification Greenhouse Gas Flux and Agriculture and Forestry Blue Book through the USDA. And we're able to quantify what that impact is on your farm. One of the things that when we started doing this work back in 2013, when we started coming up with the carbon farm planning framework, we worked with Colorado State University to develop Comet Planner. So based on our very first 3 carbon farm plans that Jeff and I wrote, we were feeding information to Colorado State for the development of Comet Planner. And now today, Comet Planner is a national tool used by many people for the planning process. They also have other tools like Comet Farm. We do also use local and peer-reviewed data if it's site-specific. We do sometimes utilize that in the carbon farm plans. But the main thing is to be very transparent through these carbon farm plans so folks can really understand where the data is coming from. And then this slide right here, I compiled for y'all to kind of see some of the components of a carbon farm plan. This plan was written by a technical assistant provider out of one of the conservation districts locally. And this farmer is actually a part of the Climate Beneficial Program here in California. They're in one of our wool pools. So starting out here, we're able to really see what their goals and objectives are. And the plan was really highly influenced by this producer's goals. And then in this second line here, I put in the table of contents. Hopefully you guys can see this. It's really tiny, but this plan is not really that different from any type of conservation or ranch plan that you might already have, or maybe you don't have, and it actually could be very beneficial for you. So it basically goes through the ranch background, your goals and objectives. It highlights resource concerns, and that is an NRCS terminology of looking at soil, animals, air, plants. And then this specific plan has a whole entire section on grazing protocols, grazing management, a grazing management plan, because this producer really wanted to understand how they could better utilize their system and enhance their grazing management. So we did write a grazing plan for this specific producer. We highlighted agroforestry systems, which meant we were highlighting areas where we could implement silvopasture, hedgerows, windbreaks, and really restore some of the riparian systems. And we focused a lot on this because that was actually something the producer was very interested in us looking at, because they do have some major streams going through, and they live along the Sacramento River. And so they have a lot of erosion happening, and they really wanted to make sure that they were able to see what types of implementation they could do to address those concerns. They do have compost application. We did look into that, and we were and figure out where on the landscape compost could be applied. And then also looking at their hay fields and vineyard systems to see if there's any enhancements that could occur there. And then down here, we're able to put in a summary of all the carbon farming practices. And we were able to quantify the soil, water, and carbon. So understanding what that water holding capacity would be on this farm if all of these practices were implemented throughout time. And then the plans also include maybe funding for the future, future funding of any implementation work, also monitoring and a short-term action plan. And then over here on the right, the table is just highlighting all of the conservation practices of which are in this carbon farm plan, a short description, the annual CO2e sequestered in metric tons per practice, and then what those benefits are, and then what tool we used. I do have to say that I do have a producer that I've worked with over the last 10 years, or less than 10 years, probably 8 years, who actually carries his carbon farm plan around with him. And he brings it everywhere to educate people on what he's doing, and also brings it into his business meetings for selling his eggs. So he's been able to learn a lot over the years, and it has benefited him substantially in his understanding as well. So this right here is a map. One of the things that we do with these carbon farm plans is we do map out every single thing for the producer on the landscape. And so you can just see how detailed some of the maps can be. And this one right here contains all the practices that this planner included in this carbon farm plan. But oftentimes planners will then also break these out by section or by system type. So then we can get a closer snapshot of exactly what is happening on that landscape. And then right here is just a table that correlates with what was mapped here. And then you can see annually, if they were to implement everything recommended by this producer, they could sequester approximately 3,245 tons annually. And then in 20 years, that would equate to about 99,092 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And then this next slide here is just another photo of a map that I created several years ago for a producer who also wanted to enhance their grazing systems. So before we wrote this plan, these producers only had 4 fields, actually 2 fields, 2 pastures, and we were able to help them think about installing fencing, permanent and temporary fencing, to really meet their goals and objectives of being able to move their animals, thinking about where water infrastructure could go for them. Also restoring the oak woodland that they already had on this property, and then really thinking about implementing other practices such as hedgerows, windbreaks, and restoring the riparian areas. So this is just showing you guys another map where we were able to think about all those opportunities. And this slide here just shows us some of the co-benefits of increasing farm system carbon, and I think you guys probably already we've drilled this into your head. At least Jeff has mentioned this several times before, but really thinking about our farming systems and increasing carbon, we can increase our soil fertility, our production, improve water quality and quantity. We can really help with wildfire resilience through this management, increasing biodiversity and drought and flood resistance. Also, one thing with this grant is that we are committed to, I think, enhancing, what was it, not over, like almost 9,000 acres of habitat and biodiversity. So hoping that we'll be able to do a lot of restoration work and some, or like plantings of hedgerows and windbreaks, or tree shrub establishment in some of these areas. And that's across the whole grant, not specific to the Northern Great Plains. So this is the question that we get all the time, or what are the economic benefits? Does this pan out? One of the things is that a carbon farm plan is just a plan. So it is just helping you think about your farmscape or landscape differently. Doesn't mean you have to implement everything that is recommended in a carbon farm plan, but it will help you think about and identify where practice are applicable on your landscape. So some of those economic benefits is that carbon farm plans can help one, access price premiums through fiber shed or this climate smart commodity grant. And Rachel will get into that a little bit more. It can help you access funds throughout NRCS programs or various grant avenues out there, even philanthropy at times, and identify and implement impactful carbon farm practices to address on-farm resource concerns and opportunities. So once it's implemented, it can help reduce inputs and costs. We have seen this with several of our producers. It can help increase productivity and resilience, and really potentially increase the land value, reduce your crop insurance rate, access payments or carbon or other ecosystem services. As Jeff said, this is just maybe potentially setting folks up for a carbon farm or carbon market somewhat in the future. And then one of the other things, just thinking about these carbon farm plans, if a practice is new for you for implementation, we would never recommend that you would, maybe apply compost to your thousands of acres. We would want to start small and really work with you on being able to make sure that it is doable on your landscape before going bigger. So we really do work closely, producers and technical service providers, to make sure that we can implement successful projects on our landscapes. And that is all I have for you guys today. And I hope you guys have some questions for us. I know this is pretty high level, but we're here today to be able to answer questions, to talk to you, and allow you guys to get to know us a little bit more, and hear about some of the work we've done. So should I stop sharing screen?
But we can leave this up for a second. Do we have any questions?
Yeah. And if you don't have questions, we are more than happy to jump on a call with anybody at any time, or you can email us and we can answer questions through email too. I know it's a lot of information to take in, so